Hi, my name is Tony Van Veen, CEO of Discmakers. Welcome to part 4 of our series exploring the pros and cons of being signed to a label versus remaining independent. We've already explored the pros and cons of remaining an independent artist and of being on a major label. If you missed any of the previous videos, there's a link below to the first video and you can start there. Today, we're going to explore the pros and cons of being signed to an independent label. So let's start by defining what an independent label actually is. An indie label is a record label that is not affiliated with or funded by one of the 3 major labels, Universal, Sony, or WMG. That said, independent labels span the gamut from large labels that call themselves independent but use major distributors and all the way to small one-person hobby operations that run out of a spare bedroom in Boise. So for that reason, we really can't paint every indie label with the same brush. However, in the interest of time, that is exactly what I'm going to try to do in today's video. So hold on to your hat. Here we go. So let me start by saying that being on an indie label can bring many of the benefits that you could get from being on a major label, including a possible advance, distribution and promo support, and the prestige of being signed to a cool label. Here are some additional pros specific to being on an indie label. Starting with, you will get more attention than if you were on a major label, where it's so easy to get lost in the shuffle. Indie labels have smaller artist rosters than a major, and so it's more important to them that every artist has a decent shot at success. The indie label will also specialize in your genre. Remember, there's so many more musical genres out there than what the majors can put out. And odds are that no matter how niche you are, there is an indie label out there that loves that genre and knows just how to help artists that play that kind of music get ahead. Now, if you sign up with the right indie label, you can also benefit from very targeted artist development, which is something that the major labels have generally kind of gotten away from in the last decade. I mean, indie labels will know your genre, and they will know what fans in your genre want. And some indies function almost a bit like a farm team for the majors. I mean, they know that their role is to grow artists over time. And selfishly, they want to grow them so that they can see more sales and revenues. And for that reason, they've developed the skills to develop artist careers. But, you know, at some point, they know that artists on their label, if they get too big, will jump over to one of the majors. Now, on an indie label, you can also benefit from much better release planning, probably than if you do it on your own, and also from much shorter production cycles than if you were on a major. And royalty rates at indie labels can be larger than at the majors. I mean, depending on your deal and on what you need the label to do for you and how much in terms of streams and fans and potential sales you can bring to the label, I've heard of royalties rates as high as 30 or even 50, and in one case, 70%. Now, 70 is uncommon, and so is 50-50, and let's be honest, most of the time, the royalties will be much lower. But there are opportunities to make a better deal on royalties than if you go to a major. And at an indie label, you are much more likely to work with individuals who you can get to know and who are all extremely passionate about and knowledgeable about the music. Now, don't get me wrong, at a major label, there's many passionate, knowledgeable people about music as well, but there's also plenty for who it's just a day job. Now, as we start discussing the cons of being signed to an independent record label, let me state here as well that many of the drawbacks of being signed to a major label also apply to being on an indie label. This can include a loss of artistic control, having to give up your individual intellectual property rights, and potentially unfavorable contract terms. And here are some additional cons specific to being signed to an indie. The biggest con, I think, from being signed to an indie label is probably financial uncertainty. I mean, as I mentioned before, many small labels are basically small, cash-poor operations owned by someone who's super passionate about the music. However, that passion doesn't always translate into financial stability. Some label owners even have day jobs to sustain them. But even the larger labels can have cash flow issues because it takes months to get paid by the distributors. And so that can mean that you as the artist are usually the last to get paid. You know, when the monies come into the label, they first pay themselves, the owners, they pay the staff, they pay the rent, they pay those vendors who they have to keep happy. You know, they frequently juggling paying which vendors they pay. And only after that, if there's cash left over, you will get paid. And that, unfortunately, for some artists, maybe never. Royalty offers at indie labels can also be more creative, right? When my band back in the day struck a deal with a label to release our records, our royalty was that of the initial pressing of 1,500 records. We would get 150 records for free to sell at shows. And if there was a reorder, then we'd make another deal. But hey, we were signed. Now, indie labels frequently do not offer advances to artists for budgetary reasons. If there is an advance offered, it does happen, it will usually be much more modest than a major label advance. But hey, again, an advance is an advance. In general, indie labels, by their nature as smaller enterprises, also tend to have limited budgets. That means that everything from recording and manufacturing to promotion has to be done economically and sometimes on a shoestring. So it's important for you to know what you're going to get into. And lastly, and maybe the second biggest concern after financial instability potentially, is that the independent label space is full of shady characters who won't hesitate to take an unsuspecting artist for a ride. I mean, since I began this series a couple weeks ago, a number of artists contacted me with stories of how they were ripped off, how the label stole their copyrights, how the label wouldn't release distribution rights after the artist had fulfilled their contract, and how the label flat out never paid them what they promised. Unfortunately, the music industry attracts more than its fair share of hustlers, and many of them work at independent labels. Now, because independent labels span the gamut from hobbyist labels to effectively mini majors or major indies, the pros and cons of being on an indie label can vary greatly depending on the label that may be interested in signing you. One thing's for sure. When an indie label comes calling, no matter how excited you are, you can't jump into bed with them without doing lots of due diligence. After all, you need to know, is this label legit or am I going to get ripped off? So tune in next time when I will be discussing what questions to ask a label to make sure that they are the right fit for you and that you won't be taken advantage of. I hope you will join me then.